Hi all, welcome back to the channel. In this video we are going to check out the 10 most essential Marlon Brando performances. Before going to the video, please subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon to get new video updates. 1. A Streetcar Named Desire, 1951. Every star owes their career to a single project, but few have reached the kind of overnight fame that Brando achieved with his instantly iconic Stanislavski in A Streetcar Named Desire. Brando became a draw thanks to Elia Kazan's debut production of what would become perhaps Tennessee Williams' best-known play, opposite Jessica Tandy, aged just 24. When the director came to bring the play to the screen 4 years later, Tandy was replaced by the more famous Vivian Leigh, but Kazan stuck with Brando, who became an instant megastar once the film opened. And little wonder. As Stanley, the brutish brother-in-law of fading Belle Blanche Du Bois, Brando is magnetic, even, and almost especially, when he's barely doing anything at all. Indelibly sexy, swaggering, animalistic and balancing a sense of real danger with occasional fleck of childlike joy and even a kind of romance. His performance threatens to topple the film over into the Stanislavski show, and yet here Brando's still generous enough to be in service of Leigh and his other co-stars. Even today, actors reprising their famous onstage roles can end up feeling over the top and overly theatrical, but that's never remotely a threat with Brando here. There's never a moment where he feels anything but real. It's easy to be hyperbolic about a performance like this, but screen acting was honestly never quite the same after Streetcar. 2. Julius Caesar, 1953. Amid simply one of the greatest casts ever assembled for a Hollywood Shakespeare adaptation, to say that Brando is the standout in Joseph L. Mankiewicz's Julius Caesar is both kind of misleading and totally true. Misleading, because the rest of the cast, particularly Mason's noble Brutus and Gielgud's devious Cassius, are equally strong, but true because Brando embodies Mark Antony's conflicted charisma better than probably any other screen incarnation. It was a risk. The role would net him the third of 4 consecutive Best Actor nominations, but when casting was first announced, it was met with derision. The great mumbler not just taking on Shakespearean dialogue, but in the Friends, Romans, Countryman address, one of the most famous of the Bard's political speeches. Brando himself was apprehensive, but taking advice from Shakespearean Thesp Gielgud, his diction is crisp and assured, and the words really sing. He commands here, giving Mark Antony brooding depths as well as glorious handsomeness, which may seem frivolous, but sexing up Shakespeare, especially the political plays, is no mean feat. In fact, there were reports that he and Mason clashed, but looking at it now, their differing approaches work. Mason's more classical style suits the noble, old-school Republican Rome of Brutus, while Mark Antony, being played with Brando's method edge, is the very embodiment of the new, the young, the impetuous, the dangerous, the end of the status quo. 3. On the Waterfront, 1954. There are many surprising omissions from the recent BBC poll of the 100 greatest American films, but perhaps none is quite as flabbergasting as the absence of Elia Kazan's towering classic about union unrest and corrupted idealism on the Hoboken Docklands. Not only did the film win 8 of its 12 Oscar nominations, it deals so precisely with the flip side of the coin toss that is the American dream, that it feels like an inarguable inclusion in any such list. But then again, there is a broad streak of un-Americanness here, ironic, considering both Kazan and writer Bud Schulberg named names, as the film glorifies the common working man and the power of brotherhood, rather than the exceptionalist individualism that is the capitalist way. And Brando's performance is the perfect encapsulation of that approach. His Terry Malloy is both unique and ordinary. The grace and sensitivity of this performance makes us feel for Malloy as a real person, yet Brando also hints at the oceanic depths that roil beneath. In fact, if Kazan's film overall is a singular achievement in uniting elements of film noir filmmaking with an uncompromising social realism, it derives a huge amount of that energy from Brando's sublime mix of stagecraft and spontaneity. This is not his showiest or most iconic role, it is simply his best. 4. The Wild One, 1957. A young Brando had screen-tested for the long-gestating film that eventually became Rebel Without a Cause back in 1947, but while he might have lost out on that one, he got his own 1950s rebellious young lead in The Wild One, the controversial biker gang drama from director Laszlo Benedek and producer Stanley Kramer. Swaggering to a degree that he makes Stanislavski look like a shrinking violet, Brando plays Johnny Strubler, the leader of the Black Rebels motorcycle club, who invade the quiet town of Wrightsville, causing havoc with the locals, and instigating a romance between Johnny and Kathy, the daughter of the local police chief. The film was undeniably something of an exploitation picture, preying on real-life worries about the fears of motorcycle gangs, but the film's pop culture impact went further than that. Like Rebel and the Blackboard Jungle, it helped to create the teenager as an identity. It was banned in the UK for 14 years over fears of copycats, and created an instant icon in Brando's much-imitated sideburns and tilted cap. Much of this obscures that The Wild One isn't, well, a particularly great film, heavy-handed, reactionary, tenured, lacking in flair, and with a rather anonymous supporting cast. And yet Brando's so smolderingly charismatic, so soulful, so quietly sad, that he carries the picture with him. 5. Plus Sayonara, 1957. This list contains inarguably classic films with inarguably astounding Brando performances. It also contains less than classics with great Brando performances. But Sayonara might be the most problematic inclusion. It's not a truly great film, however well-meaning its anti-racism sentiment for the time. It's bought at the expense of a deeply reactionary and Orientalist view of the exotic subservience of Japanese womanhood, and it features Ricardo Montalban playing Japanese. And nor is the Oscar-nominated Brando flawless in the role of the Korean War-era Air Force major who falls for a Japanese actress. His southern accent is a slightly awkward affectation. Yet despite, or perhaps because of, its many issues, Sayonara, from director Joshua Logan earns its slot here. It illuminates the reaches of his talents better, perhaps, than many of his more famous roles. His major groover has no deep, menacing darkness, he does not have Terry Malloy's brokenness, Stanley Kulski's rage or Colonel Kurtz's madness. Groover is among the simplest characters Brando ever played, a decent, patriotic flying ace whose ingrained and entirely representative prejudices are overcome by love. It's Brando as an everyman, and it's a truly beautiful, sensitive performance. Supported by great turns from Red Buttons and Mushi Amiki without the volcanic bluster or eat-the-room presence of some of his more famous turns, here we watch his method applied on a much smaller scale and he delivers a precise and thrillingly empathetic embodiment of a good man incrementally changing his mind. 6. The Godfather, 1972. The 1960s were not a good time for Brando, with critically derided flop after critically derided flop. His star had faded to such an extent that when Francis Ford Coppola wanted to cast him in his adaptation of a mafia-themed pulp novel called The Godfather, Paramount resisted, only letting it happen if the actor swapped his fee for a percentage, and agreed to pay for any overages resulting from his own behavior. It was a risk that decidedly paid off, with a performance that's briefer than you remember, but that haunts not just the rest of Coppola's hugely successful trilogy, but the crime movie in general. Playing a good 15 years older than he really was, and famously embellished himself with cotton buds in his cheeks, Brando is Vito Corleone, the don of a New York mob family, facing new competition and an uncertain passing of the torch to his children. It's a much imitated, much parodied performance, and for good reason. He's a representative of an older, more simple world, one that Brando himself had helped to put away, and there's a deep melancholy, particularly in the latter stages, at the way he visibly slips away, both content to be dying naturally with his family, and yet somehow disappointed to be out of the loop. It won the actor his second Oscar. 7. Last Tango in Paris, 1972. A few months after The Godfather smashed box office records, Brando cemented his comeback with another critically adored hit, Bernardo Bertolucci's incredibly controversial Last Tango in Paris. After he felt increasingly disengaged during the 1960s, this and Don Corleone saw him reappear with a new fire in his belly, here as Paul, a grieving American in Paris who begins a provocative affair with a much younger French woman, Jean. Originally intended for Jean-Louis Trintignant, the character is an open wound of a man, giving in to his deepest and darkest sexual desires, and it feels somehow that this is a Brando stripped by Bertolucci of his fallbacks. With few ticks or cotton bud makeup tricks up his sleeve, it's an almost unbearably raw performance, at once sympathetic, pathetic, pitiable and loathsome. Not every actor could pull off the philosophical gymnastics of Bertolucci's dialogue, but Brando pulls it off effortlessly, and his odd chemistry with Schneider is palpable, even if their real-life relationship was decidedly rockier. And though it didn't prove to be, as Pauline Kael had predicted, the most liberating movie ever made, it undoubtedly retains its power to shock and provoke for a modern-day audience. It's a shame that our modern films about sex and sexuality are closer to 50 Shades of Grey than to this, but then if Brando had played Christian Grey, we might think very differently about that film. 8. Apocalypse Now, 1979. We hear a lot about Brando's Colonel Walter Kurtz before we actually see him in Francis Ford Coppola's landmark Apocalypse Now. He is discussed in hushed, fearful tones throughout the film as a kind of mythic figure, someone to be feared as much, if not more so, as the Viet Cong. So it's kind of amazing that when we finally see Kurtz sometime near the film's hellish denouement, hiding in what appears to be monastic seclusion, sheathed in dark shadows and speaking with a tremble in his voice that suggests pain beyond anything you or I could comprehend, that he's somehow even more terrifying than we expected. As a decorated U.S. Special Forces officer who finds himself lost to insanity brought on by the horrors of war, not to mention the whims of the local populace, who fancy him some sort of god, Brando exudes an intoxicating mixture of epic grandeur and real, human pain. Film lore goes that, in addition to his already infamous bouts of erratic behavior, Brando also showed up to the shoot of Apocalypse drastically overweight, thus forcing Coppola to shoot his scenes with his star just so in hopes of concealing the actor's ungainly physique. But whatever unspeakable madness Brando did during the making of this film, arguably Coppola's best, is right up there on the screen for us to marvel at. In a career of big turns, this is one of the biggest, and definitely one of the scariest. 9. The Freshman, 1990. With The Godfather back in the zeitgeist thanks to the original trilogy being closed off in the same year, Brando paid tribute to probably his best-known performance with this terminally undervalued comedy from The In-Laws and Fletch writer, director Andrew Bergman. The Freshman toplines Matthew Broderick as a young NYU student who ends up taking work for a local mobster, Carmine Sabatini, who has a lucrative side business in serving up endangered species at a supper club, and who is being pursued by the Department of Justice. It's an enjoyably odd film, and made odder by the presence of Brando, essentially reprising Don Corleone, and not looking much older here than he did there. It shouldn't work, not even remotely, and yet it does. In part it's because of Bergman, who's never really got the credit he deserves for the kind of whip-smart mainstream comedies he makes, but in large part, it's because of Brando. It would have been so easy for him to phone this in, but perhaps spurred on by the rest of the cast, he deftly replicates the earlier performance, but builds on it, too. He's never playing for laughs, but there's a spry wit to his timing here, and he's remarkably funny, and even endearing as a result. 10. The Score, 2001. The score could have been terrible and it still would have been notable for being the only time Brando and his disciple Robert De Niro ever appeared in a film together. De Niro, bringing shades of his hard, calculating Neil McCauley from Michael Mann's Heat, plays another career thief and Brando plays his tough shit old boss. That alone should be reason enough to see it. The sight of these two cinematic greats simply sharing the screen together makes the film worthy of at least one viewing. The score definitely isn't terrible, but it also isn't great. It's a solid, often groaningly predictable crime thriller directed with restraint and patience by Frank Oz. Brando isn't in the movie much, but he doesn't need to be. His legend casts a shadow that more than makes up for his loss of screen time. His Max is a large, effusive, often profane man who speaks in that characteristic Brando whisper and whose craggy, weathered face and bulky frame seem to suggest a great personal history. Brando allegedly had difficulties with director Oz during the shoot, although the Helmer has said, in later years, that he felt that he was perhaps being tougher on the iconic older actor than he needed to be, but it doesn't show in the performance. As always, Mr. Mumbles was all in here, and the results are riveting to watch.